benefactors, many of whose names were given to Native children. The photos captured the students' transition from savagery to salvation. One example, and likely the most famous before and after photo, depicts a Navajo student named Tom Torlino. Take a moment to notice the key differences, not just in the way Tom Torlino is represented through the change in the length of his hair and his dress, also consider the ways that the photographs are lit and developed. Even though this is 100 years before Photoshop became regularly available to photography enthusiasts, the photographer has underlit and underexposed the first picture, making Tom Torlino appear darker, while brightly lighting and perhaps overexposing the second image, lightening the skin tone and features. Using photography as a technique of territory and white supremacy, the photos take on metaphorical significance as the exposure of indigeneity is made to seem like an accurate documentation of Mr. Torlino's appearance and dress. Instead, the photo is used to expose the colonial assumptions around indigeneity, painting him as a prototypical assimilated Native person. These photos were used as proof of what the white man's education could do for natives. It had the power to make us legible to the US as civilized and eligible members of society. The before and after photos employed by Pratt had such an impact at the time that Helen Ludlow, a representative of the Indian Rights Association, in response to photos, wrote this to a friend. Before me, as we write, are two photographs, the Indians as they went into and the same Indians as they came out of Fort Marion. Looking at these photos, we are disposed to agree with the warriors of that the old fort was their tomb. These half-naked, crouching forms with blankets dropping from their gauntness, savage locks streaming over their eyes and down to their knees, with barbaric ornaments of huge brass hoops in their ears and on their arms, with fierce and sullen faces. These are not the bodies that should be when God should recreate the abject souls, give them bodies as it pleased him, straight, erect, manly, with smiling, earnest faces, and hopeful, onlooking eyes as they stand on resurrection day with their prison gates behind them. End quote. The rhetoric of salvation and the project of assimilation are clear, using schools as sites of cultural genocide. And make no mistake, violence, physical violence, emotional, cultural, epistemological, was a key part of terrorizing children to shed parts of themselves when they were beaten for speaking their language, their clothes were burned and replaced, and their hair shorn to more closely align with US Army standards. The physical, social, and rhetorical violence served similar ends as scalping bounties, removing the indigenous presence and cementing a colonial dominance. That it did so under the guise of schooling makes it no less insidious and violent than the practice of scalping. Many of the young people removed to Carlisle would never see their families again. They ran away only to die of exposure, committed suicide, or slipped into a foreign life away from the communities and lands from which they came. Erasure and concomitant absence took the form of assimilation or death. Not every student managed in this way. Some of them would return home to become leaders in their communities. And some of my colleagues like Kay Chanina Lomawaima and Terry McCarty have documented the incredible ways students resisted the violence of boarding schools and survived. The relationship between the indigenous peoples and schooling, however, would never be the same. In the 20th century, hair continued its key role in the relationship between indigenous lands and policing of indigenous bodies by demarcating who could be considered American Indian under federal law. The marking of natives as, quote, indigenous or not would be used to regulate and enable the dispossession of indigenous lands. Around the same time as boarding schools were established, former Massachusetts US Senator Henry Dawes, in advocating for the division of Indian land and people via the General Allotment Act of 1887, which would later be known as the Dawes Act, noted, and I'm quoting here from Senator Dawes, "Till these people will consent to give up their lands and divide them among their citizens so that each can own the land he cultivates, they will not make much more progress," end quote. The progress referred to was the privatization and personal ownership of property and dilution of communally held indigenous lands by eliminating tribal governance and granting the largest parcels, which were 160 acres, of land to male heads of family, offering U.S. citizenship to natives who adopted the habits of civilized life. The United States was tactical in their division of native lands. Pivotal to the division and conquest of indigenous peoples has been the contestation over who the federal government would recognize as being Indian. The recognition, or lack thereof, had significant implications for how land was possessed and dispossessed. The fewer tribal people recognized by the federal government, the fewer people who would have access to land, treaty and trust rights, and obligations. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 sought to determine to what extent non-federally recognized tribes were, quote, Indian, and thereby gain a right to land through federal recognition. The act also created guidelines that would allow these native peoples, should they be recognized by the federal government, receive constitutive federal monies, recognition of land rights, and federal resources. Next slide, please. The Bureau of Indian Affairs investigated the claims of Eastern tribes to determine their eligibility under the legislation. Carl Seltzer, a Harvard anthropologist hired by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, was sent to investigate the claims of indigenous peoples of Robeson County. A physical anthropologist also accompanied Seltzer. His task was to ascertain the racial ancestry and degree of Indian blood of Robeson County Indians. These two anthropologists used rigorously scientific means employed to identify the degree of Indian blood were based on the physical features and blood type of applicants. The test deemed necessary due to the amount of mixed-race peoples in the eastern United States who demanded the recognition of their indigenous ancestry. Seltzer's scientific tests included running a pencil through an individual's hair and shaking their body to see if the pencil fell out. If the pencil fell out, they were marked as Indian. If the pencil remained in the hair of the individual, the applicant was marked as Negroid. The test played off tropes associated with native peoples and the pseudoscience of eugenics dominant of the era. It is worth noting here that the same pencil tests were later used in apartheid South Africa in distinguishing between races. Those peoples that Seltzer scientifically studied had been on those lands for thousands of years, long before Harvard was created, long before Seltzer's ancestors arrived in North America, and long before there was a Bureau of Indian Affairs and its parent federal government. Archaeological and other anthropological data clearly demonstrated that these were, in fact, native peoples. Missed in Seltzer's analysis is also the idea that many native peoples of the East Coast who resisted removal, adopted survivors of slavery, intermarried with them and the Scotch and Irish, and engaged in the determination of their membership through adoption and marriage. In this instance, pseudoscience, the use of a pencil in someone's hair to determine these claims to land, incited and induced terror among them, and it overrode all common sense regarding culture. It denies self-determination at a government level in denying recognition of the community by the United States or the indigenous nation's ability to define who gets to be a member of their nation. And framing them as non-Indians shrunk their land base. I just want to note in that picture, you can see those two girls, they're sisters, and one passed the pencil test and the other failed the test. So one of them was considered Indian and the other was not, which gets at the pseudo-scientific nature of these tests. These peoples, my peoples, the Lumbee tribe, were later granted federal recognition as Indian for the second time in 1956, although this was done with limited access to federal resources that accompany the recognition. And I should just say, 10 days ago, President Biden said he would sign a law that would grant permanent and full federal recognition. And yesterday, President Trump also signaled to my tribe that they would do the same. Some of this may actually be tied to the fact that North Carolina Carolina is in play, and there are 45,000 of us in the state of North Carolina who are voting. But I digress. The pencil test highlights how people can be removed and erased from land through a cultural and legal violence that deploys science as a form of terror. Federal recognition of sovereignty and thereby land ownership and jurisdiction relied on pseudoscience that deploys anti-Blackness to remove rights to land and claims to indigeneity. Native people's rights were removed not through overt violence of scalping or the overt assimilation of boarding schools and haircuts, but by simply legalizing definitions of what Native peoples and their hair looked like. Law's legitimation of white supremacist pseudoscience is a key feature of Terrortory in objectifying indigeneity to commodify land. Both Indigenous peoples and the lands that they've always lived with become disposable and defeasible. While the violence is not physical in this instance, the denial of a group of peoples belonging to the lands on which they and their ancestors had lived for thousands of years created challenges to the ownership and engagement of lands. Prior to the violence and taking of lands, there's always been an innate relationship between lands and peoples. It is an inherent and intrinsic connection. Consider our origin stories as people and peoples. Who we are is directly linked to where we come from, where our ancestors are, were, or have been. More than just a space or a place, land has value just in existing, and that's related to the people who are from there, who live there, and have always lived there. Consider, for example, again, my people, the Lumbee, who are tied to the Lumber River. That place, that river in this instance, has intrinsic value in who I am as a person and who we are as Lumbee peoples. It feeds and nurtures us, provides water for farming and fish for food. The river is a source for one of our origin stories, and it is a source of strength and inspiration for us. Our stories revolve around the river. It is us and we are it. Using a pencil to try to separate us from the lands that make up this place is a form of terror. And I should note that the anthropologists who led these efforts were products of colonial systems of thought serving colonial ends. In many instances, our places of higher learning contribute to creating and perpetrating fear amongst Indigenous peoples and others. While native use hair is no longer being scalped, the regimented hairstyles of boarding schools still exist in 21st century schooling, in dress codes and policies. These policies, though not specifically targeted at excluding native youth, they have come to enforce what Justice Sonia Sotomayor called the most crippling of thoughts: I do not belong here. Belonging is about connection to land, place, and space. Next slide, please. I've already talked and already presented to you the story of Tom Torlino from 1887 at Carlisle Indian School. His hair was cut in order to civilize him and kill the Indian and save the man in him. 133 years later, in 2017, 4-year-old Jabez Oates, a member of the Cocopah tribe, showed up to school in the Barber Hills Independent School District in Texas for his first day of school. Isn't that kid cute? This is so adorable. Jabez wore his hair long, as was the custom his mom said was a tie to his status as a Cocopah person. She had documentation of his membership in the tribe, noting that his long hair was viewed as a, quote, sign of strength, end quote. The school district thought differently. Jabez's mom, Jessica Oates, noted, and I'm quoting here, apparently the school board is a stickler for rules and can't think of any religions or cultures that would require long hair, end quote, in spite of his enrollment as a Cocopah and in spite of documentation of the cultural significance of his long hair. The length of Jabez's hair violated the school's dress policy, which aimed to promote excellence, hygiene, and to prevent disruption in the classroom. Jabez, who had been growing out his hair since birth, violated the school board policy, even though his hair was combed and put in a bun. The hair tie Jabez's mom used was later considered a quote, inappropriate hair accessory, end quote, according to the school board's policy, making Jabez's long hair as unexcellent, denigrates his Kokopah heritage, and the brands of unhygienic ties into stereotypes of savagery associated with Indigenous people. Both feed a white supremacist colonial assertion of Native inferiority, but now repackaged as generic school policy. Jabez will never have another first day of school. His joy and pleasure of being a big boy and learning was stripped from him by a rigidly enforced school policy. Jabez and his mother were left with little alternative as the policy extends to the entire school district, making a move to another school in the district impossible. The reality of being stuck was highlighted by the school superintendent who stated, and I'm quoting here, "Parents have a right to seek an appropriate educational setting for their child, just as Miss Oates has the right to place her child in a district that reflects her personal expectations for standards of appearance." End quote. Jabez's mother is a single mom who could not realistically afford to uproot her son from his community to find an entirely new school district. Jabez's choice then becomes the costly relocation of schools or the costly dislocation of his indigeneity in cutting his hair. The boarding school experience isn't far away. The superintendent argued further. There are procedures in place for addressing concerns over policy if it is Miss Oates' desire to have her son educated in Barber Hills ISD. But we would and should justifiably be criticized if our district lessened its expectations or longstanding policies simply to appease. End quote. The superintendent's intractability of this policy seems almost if he is working from a belief that the policy emerged from a higher being rather than the creation of people rooted in a colonial mindset. Policy is seen as inherent rather than recognized as a policy created by people, as the beginning or the origins of the policy is forgotten. The fact that allowing a 4-year-old Kokopah boy maintain a strong sense of his identity as appeasement is an act of violence and clearly delineates a sense of who belongs and who doesn't. 130 years have passed since Pratt established Carlisle, and it is still the case that expecting a school to respect Native culture and lessen its expectations for standards of appearance is called appeasement. The past is very much rooted in the present. The common sense and frankly ignorant response from the superintendent highlights a common axiom in American rhetoric. If you don't like it, leave it, or go where you're wanted. Just under the surface of statements like this is the real message. Your rights and a sense of belonging as an Indigenous person are not respected in this space. The illusion of school choice masks the coercive conditions and historical impediments placed on students like Jabez. The fact that a child's right to schooling and self-expression are mutable and can be repudiated with little to no thought or recourse should be shocking. Sadly, for many of us, it's the norm. We all know this is not new. The institution's response is the American response to Indigenous assertions of rights. Your rights are not respected, and go someplace else. I should note that in lots of ways, schools and colleges of education are preparing people like this superintendent. There's something for us to think about and imagine how we might begin to do that work differently in the future. Frankly, how we might do it starting now. Across these hair stories, there's a common thread in how land and Indigenous peoples are separated by Western notions of property. This goes beyond a transfer of title or changes in ownership to epistemological, axiological, ideological changes in the relationships between land and people through fear, violence, and terror. The fear of the Indigenous thus becomes part of the assimilationist policies of boarding schools that forcefully separated Indigenous people from their lands, peoples, and other connections to their heritage, in part by forcing them to cut their hair. Changing the appearance of indigeneity erases the historical and cultural connections and origins as people. And as the pencil test shows us, this is even done without having to cut anyone's hair. Simply changing the standard of what Native hair is supposed to look like is sufficient to sever legally recognized ties to land and place. Simply by running a pencil through Native people's hair, their relationship to the land was legally delegitimized through pseudoscience. Even today, as Jabez is sent home from school, no hair is cut by a school, and no pencils ever run through his long hair. However, the appearance of an indigenous hairstyle was sufficient to deploy policies that would bar him from going to school, forcing his mother to either move or remove his hair, disconnecting him from place and peoples. Next slide, please. At root, these different uses of fear, violence, and terror are all legally justified, codified, and even accepted means of dispossessing Indigenous peoples. These instances happened through law, but they are made real by fear and violence. The law makes terror possible. Unlike the federal definition of terrorism, which relies on the unlawful use of fear or force, terrorism used to dehumanize, assimilate, separate, and commodify Indigenous lands and peoples was entirely lawful. The law is central to the racialization of Indigenous peoples and the conversion of land to real property. This epistemological shift relies on terror to change the ways that people and land relate and interact. Hair becomes a focal point of tension for creating unbelonging. Certain hairstyles are given permissions to belong, while rules excluding or permitting the exclusion of these different hairstyles tell students what representations of people and history belong. The rules seem neutral. They are not targeted at Native hairstyles in this text, but the neutrality only applies for certain bodies, for specific hairstyles, and for the concomitant epistemologies, ontologies, and axiologies that accompany them. The hair stories show us that rules rooted in neutrality, learning environments, or safety are easily turned into violence. Hair is no longer removed by scalping, but now it's removed by policies, rules, and dress codes applied against Native students. Boarding schools cut and styled the hair of Native students to force conformity to white ways of being and knowing. It was an integral part of the assimilationist policies. But the violence of this civilizing act was profound, and its reverberations can still be felt today. For Native boys and men in particular, cutting long hair to become men entrenches colonized patriarchal masculinities. Indigenous males thus cannot be men in the colonial sense of humanity or as a gendered identity. They are considered only as savage or assimilable. Even though Native students are no longer taken to boarding schools, the assimilationist ideals and their violences, especially as they apply to hair, have not faded. There are similar hair stories in other communities, all of which get to the roots of belonging, violence, land, and space. Next slide, please. Thank you. Hair stories are crucial to engaging Terrortory because they highlight the ways in which violence and the fear are used to disrupt people's connections to land. Hair stories in a Terrortory framework highlight the many dimensions of violence and fear deployed against Indigenous peoples under the law, particularly in stories like Jabez's first day of school, when the policy is legal, neutrally worded, and yet weaponized against Indigenous peoples. The state, through its universities, schools, and other institutions, are part of the apparatuses that build these policies. As I just noted earlier, schools and colleges of education are core members of this work. Next slide, please. Violence in its physical, symbolic, rhetorical, epistemological, or other dimensions is used to say who does and does not belong, trying to scare away those who would contest the use of land as capital. What is lost is the importance of the land itself, the relationship of peoples to that land, and the land to its people. The human element, the presence of Indigenous peoples, is erased, removed, and hidden. What I want to highlight is the ongoing ontological, epistemological, and axiological conflict over the land. It is contesting ways of thinking about, knowing about, and valuing land. This is a narrative of who belongs and who does not, and under what conditions. It is about who gets to write the story. Thanks so much.
Dr. Brayboy, thank you for sharing your profound and compelling talk with us today, and for asking us to think about an ongoing context and practice of violence that really insists on our urgent and careful attention. I want to thank Dr. Dancy before we get into our conversation for convening and hosting this and many other conversations that really enrich our work in some powerful ways. So thank you, Dr. Dancy, and thank you also for inviting me to be in conversation with Dr. Brayboy today. For those of you participating today, I'm Sabina Vaught. I'm a professor and chair at Pitt in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Leading. And I'm excited to be in a brief dialogue with my friend and colleague, Dr. Brian Brayboy. And thank you, Brian, for agreeing to do this conversation. I changed all our questions, so they're all going to be new. You won't have heard these before. I'm kidding, everyone.
Perfect.
Just had to scare them a little bit. So I'm gonna jump into Terrortory. You talk about violence and terror as state-sanctioned or lawful structure and event. So you've talked about the physical, the material, the rhetorical, discursive, symbolic structures and events. And in a recent conversation we had where you were sort of helping me understand better what this exciting framework might offer, you pointed to Nova Scotia, where as you shared with me, white lobstermen are destroying Mi'kmaq boats and processing plants, and talked about this, or helped me think about this as an example of Terrortory. So I wonder if you might help everyone today think about how this story illustrates some of the specificities of Terrortory as an analytic, and to think about how it moves across and connects economies, rights, and ultimately education.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm so glad to be in conversation with you, my friend. So Nova Scotia, what's happening in the moment, for me, one of the draws in terms of what Jeremiah, Chen, and I are trying to do with Terrortory is both think about the fact that this idea of terror being real and state sanctioned is historic, and it's also very much in the present. For those of you who don't know, in Nova Scotia for the last, well, it's actually been an ongoing, several decades old battle between Mi'kmaq people and white lobstermen and fishermen, fundamentally about who can fish and do lobstering work there. And it is assured by the Supreme Court of Canada and in its other legal documents that Native peoples have the right to be able to fish in those places. As the economy has had this downturn, and in part related to COVID and other reasons, this has really led to an interesting standoff because white fishermen are now perpetrating acts of violence. They're attacking chief at Mi'kmaq. They have now just recently burned down a lobster processing plant. They are destroying catches. They are making it very, very difficult for Mi'kmaq people to sell the lobsters that they have. So there are thousands of lobsters going to waste, which isn't just about sort of an unnecessary taking of the lobsters' lives, because I think for lots of us who fish and eat meat, there's a relationship between what we eat that the land gives us. And land here extends beyond just terra firma. Oceans and waters, rivers, lakes are all included in the ways in which we think about land. And if you're in relationship with the land and its inhabitants, then taking that to eat and to help feed others in order to feed yourself is part of the relational process. And what's happening here is that you have these white fishermen, white Canadian fishermen, who really don't have fundamental rights to be able to take, to be able to fish under these conditions that really belong to Mi'kmaq people. Becomes an interesting an interesting set of conversations. And it's fundamentally the ways in which these fishermen are trying to assert their individual rights over group rights, because I think that's another important conversation in this, is that for Indigenous peoples, we have these group rights, a group right to fish in this case that is guaranteed by treaty that has been in process since time immemorial, since there were only Indigenous peoples in places that we now call Nova Scotia. And an assertion of individual rights over those group rights becomes really important in terms of them sort of then violently taking over, beating people up, burning things down, making roads impassable, which is all of the acts that they are doing while the police force in Canada sits by idly and arrests no one for breaking what under normal circumstances would be breaking the law, would be considered assault, would be considered a felony against peoples. And in part, it's because in many ways, Indigenous peoples have been erased, but more importantly, those connections to land have been erased. And seeing Native peoples as present, viable, functioning human beings today has been erased. So for me, then, Terrortory just allows us to take a bit of a comprehensive view around a case like Meemaw. I mean, there are lots of cases that we can argue or sort of think about this with, whether it's pipelines, oil pipelines and transfers, and the ways in which that gets enacted. But importantly, in this instance and in many current instances, capitalism gets implicated, and this battle between individual and group and communal rights are the sticking point between them gets implicated.
And I think you've connected that to, and you've referenced Indigenous scholars describing how sovereignty actually works, like the direction it actually works. And I think you've connected the function of territory to a deliberate confusion around that. So I wonder if you'd elaborate just a little bit about that sovereignty dynamic.
Yeah, so it's interesting the way in which sovereignty has been framed for many of us, and in the US and in Canada, which is really the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples to be able to determine their own future. And people will point, many scholars and others will point back to legal documents. In the US, it's the Constitution, where Native peoples are mentioned twice, and seen as individuals and groups not taxed, very much like, say, France, for example, which then creates this notion that we are nations. What I think is really important is, and I'm really drawing here on the work of Vine Deloria Jr., who argues, in fact, and others, including Joanne Barker and Taigi Alfred, and it's a sense that Native peoples are actually extra constitutional. That is, our sovereignty isn't tied to the Constitution. The truth is, and I find this to be a really compelling argument that Taigi Alfred and Joanne Barker have been making, which is it's the US and Canada who get their sovereignty from Native peoples, not the other way around. There are Native peoples who are here first. There are treaties that get signed between Native peoples and these fledgling countries that aren't yet countries, but are in the process of forming as such. And in order to do so, they have to have a legal and binding agreement with a recognized nation. That is Native peoples. And there are lots of nations. And so we've kind of flipped the script here. I mean, I think what Barker and Alfred, really building on what Deloria and Light are arguing in a really classic book from 1982, is that we need to rethink these larger notions of legal and political sovereignty as somehow Native peoples getting these rights from Canada and the US. It's completely the other way around. And I've drawn a bit on an interesting place for me in some ways. People are like, how'd you get there? But I've drawn a bit on Bourdieu and Passeron's work. And they've got this classic 1977 book called Reproduction. And in it, on page 9, they introduce this concept called Genesis amnesia. which is essentially forgetting the beginning. And what happens when you forget the beginning is that you can create a new set of myths that become truths. So with each retelling of the myth, it becomes a truth and it erases the actual beginning. So we don't know, lots of people don't know the fact that it was treaties with tribal nations that really helped the US and Canada grow quickly. If you look at those early treaties, and I really recommend to you, there's a 2005 piece by Rebecca Sosi where she really begins to dig into an early piece, a treaty with the Delaware, Lenni Lenape peoples, who were actually claim some homelands in the Pittsburgh area. And what you see there is a fundamental recognition of Lenape peoples as a nation, as holders of and caretakers and guardians of the land, not as some sort of domestic dependence, which is what comes 100 years, not 100 years later, about 40 years later, is a reframing of it. But think about how quickly we forget these things. So I think the power of myth, and part of why I ended my talk the way I did by saying it's about who gets to tell the story, becomes really important because we've got to start to dig in on some commonly held assumptions and beliefs about history that have us believing one thing when in fact there's a whole nother set of stories there. Civic education is going to continue to kind of come up. I suspect I find civic education to be an interesting place for us to have these conversations. But here's the last point I want to make, and then I'll sort of try to be quiet for a little bit, but which is the erasure of the origins of the beginnings is a form of violence. The fact that we participate in schools and colleges of education and teachers and others actively participate in that erasure, whether we know it or not, that we are actually doing it, is a form of violence. And not just against Native peoples, although certainly against Native peoples, it's a form of violence against everyone for us to not have some sense of where did this all come from?
So I'm going to try to connect some points here in this second question. So you've argued before that monuments are a story, and they're a terror story because, in part, for many reasons, but because in part, if I've understood you correctly, they do assert a myth that is one of a terrorizing erasure. But you've also suggested through Terrortory and in conversation that this analytic might elaborate for us how we think of what's a monument. So you raised in conversation with me this example of Kanaka Maoli people protesting and protecting the summit of Mauna Kea against this 30-meter telescope, which gets described as an instrument of technology, a tool of science. But you've sort of thought about, I think, how Terrortory, or you might think with us today about how Terrortory might actually, through those different threads you were pulling together, the way in which education and its content or its disciplines and its practices tells a story that supports Genesis amnesia, and that it is a story intended to continue Terrortory. So how might this 30-meter telescope be under the analytic of Terrortory a kind of monument? How might we make sense of that? And then how might that help us think about, again, how Terrortory pushes us to revisit what we do in our field?
Yeah, you know, monuments as they relate to institutions of higher education abound. I think it's really important. Sometimes they are names on buildings. They are statues of founders or important people. They are founders of the university, that is, or of ideas, or of former governors. In the case of Mauna Kea, which I think is fascinating, the monument is actually the telescope. I think people sometimes think about it, well, it's Mauna Kea that's a monument. It's not. What Kanaka peoples are doing there is really protecting a relative from the placement of this monument that is framed and rooted. This is, in some ways, if you think about what happened with Jabez, in sort of the neutrally worded piece of what's happening in that independent school district in Barber Hills, Texas. There are scientists from across the world who want to go and use a 30-meter telescope because it is considered to be the best place to be able to view the sky and space because of the conditions that are there. It's situated on the back of a Kanaka ancestor in the process. The argument ends up being over, well, science needs this, and it's just a piece of rock. What happens in the sense that there are, and the 30-meter telescope isn't the only telescope on Mauna Kea, by the way. There are many, many others, some of which have been decommissioned. The University of Hawaii has said that they will get rid of them. They have not chosen to actually get rid of those. I think Kanaka peoples have said, look, if this is really about science, and get rid of the other things, and then we can have a conversation. But it's a form of violence enacted on an ancestor that is Mauna Kea in some ways, but also an overrun in the beliefs of people who say that's space that shouldn't be used in this particular way. The university doesn't engage, and I'm not actually picking on just on the University of Hawaii. There are lots of our institutions where this is actually true. But think about the form of violence that says it's about science and the advancement of the world as a way to then run over people's cosmological views of their origins. So Mauna Kea becomes really important to part of the origin stories of Kanaka peoples, to their continued sense of connection to other islands and throughout the Pacific as a particular place. It's a sacred spot that's been desecrated by this, all in the name of science. And so I think what happens in the Genesis amnesia piece of this is people have sort of forgotten the fact that building something on someone's sacred places and spaces is violent in and of itself. Ignoring then the protest is violent in and of itself. Continuing to ignore it and then inviting people from across the world to come in and bring that in does it, and it completely erases the importance of the place to peoples. Again, I think that's true. So that's the case of Mauna Kea, but my alma mater, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, had this monument called Silent Sam, which was this monument of a Confederate soldier marching north, by the way, which becomes really important. It was facing north. It's eventually toppled. It's created all kinds of issues and lawsuits there. And I think one of the important things I want to try to say before our conversations end about this is that the draw for me about Terrortory and working with Jeremiah Chin, who's a Black man, is the fact that we want to try to rethink sort of what counts as indigeneity, but we also want to begin to rethink whether or not this terror is strictly related to Indigenous peoples. It's not. Terrortory actually relates to Indigenous peoples. It relates to, in this case, Black African American peoples, these monuments that perform and engage these violences against the memories of whether it's the Civil War or someone else who was a Klan leader or what have you, whether it was known or unknown, are actually forms of violence that are intended to control what people know, what they think about whether or not they feel like they belong. So imagine all of these people impacted by the ravages of slavery, having to walk by on a daily basis this Confederate soldier who is marching north. And then for people to object to removal of that is also profoundly violent. So it takes us back to a civil war. It takes us back to slavery, 1619, and brings us all the way into 2020, where institutions of higher education become complicit in shutting its doors and possibilities to people that look like me and look like Jeremiah. And again, I think this is about the structure of what that does, but it also happens to be about the events in it and the daily events in it and how we think about the future. So even as institutions begin to rename buildings and to be thoughtful about this, renaming a building is one start of this. I think what Terrortory is going to call is what other forms of, and I'm only using this, I don't mean it in a formal sense, of reparations, or what other forms of transforming our institutions might we do? You think about the superintendent in Barbara Hills, how might a place like your school or college of education at Pitt begin to rethink how you're preparing principals and superintendents in terms of what kinds of policies get created, or how are you preparing people who might sit on school boards to be more thoughtful about the violence that gets played out by something that is seemingly neutrally worded? I think that's the power of this. And for me, and I think for Jeremiah, the power of Terrortory is really about the insidious ways in which it has creeped into the fabric of society and the fabric of policies and the fabric of structures and institutions that that's often just completely invisible to us.
Thank you for that and for thinking in dialogue. And I think that's really a perfect place for us to transition to Renee and to open it up to Q&A to think again about what is our school doing, and to go back a little bit to what you said about sovereignty. What is this school doing? What are all schools, departments, colleges of ed doing as they relate to this large state project of education, when the state they're relating to is one that it gets its sovereign status through these processes and treaties. And so I think there's a rich and complex way for us to think about our work in terms of Terrortory. So thank you for that. Appreciate the conversation. Renee, I'm going to hop off and hand it off to you. And I think you have to unmute. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vaught.
Thank you. So, Dr. Brayboy, we have just a few questions. One of our viewers is very happy that you were talking about hair. Primarily, she's saying, as a Black woman, I can appreciate the issues surrounding hair types and styles. Our hair is also being policed, and others' perceptions of our hair particularly determines our abilities to assess and belong in a space. So thank you so much for this conversation. So, I mean, we all see that when we're listening to, especially as a Native and Black woman, going through those types of issues in school. Just to point out the student that you showed us, but with braids and weaves and other things that unfortunately Black women are suspended from school. Can you give us a little bit more like your take on that?
Yeah, thank you. This is huge for us. And I think that there are, and it's part of where I ended on the fact where Jeremiah and I, who is married to a Black woman and has Black children, I think has really come into play in the ways in which we're thinking about Terrortory as something that goes, it's not just sort of something for Indigenous peoples or for Native peoples. The case of hair becomes super important. I should add, I think it's profound the way in which the law has engaged Black women's hair, for example, whether it's the American Airlines case or others about what constitutes professional, right, in terms of natural hair and weaves and other kinds of things. So we are starting to really explore that and to think seriously about what do we do with the terror inflicted on the hair that someone was born with, and somehow the values, the axiological pieces of this about what gets valued as good, true, right, and beautiful. And in this instance, beautiful and appropriate becomes a really important piece. And I'm totally blanking on his name right now, but I do want to note the school where Jabez Oates went, the school district, the Barbara Hills Independent School District, ISD, is the same place where last year there was a a young Black man who wasn't allowed to walk across the stage and graduate because of his braids and his hair. And it was the same superintendent using the same policy that prohibited him from doing that. In New Jersey, your neighbor state, and I realize you are on the western side of the state, but in New Jersey, last year in a wrestling tournament, there was a young Black man, a wrestler, who was told he had to cut his hair because of New Jersey athletic policy before he could go. And this young man was given the choice of not cutting his hair, and his team potentially not then being able to progress in the tournament, or cut his hair. And there on the moment cut his hair. And for any of us who watched that and saw it, you start to realize just how profound of an act of violence that is. What does it mean for a Black woman to show up with her hair in her natural form and be told that she's either unprofessional or not welcome there, or doesn't meet company policy? Are things that I think we've got to begin to pull apart and disentangle. So Jeremiah and I, working with Danielle Lucero, who's one of our grad students, are starting to look at larger intersections and overlaps between hair as it relates to African Americans, Blacks, and Native folks. And it's pretty profound in the initial reading of these articles, how problematic and troubling the engagement of hair is and can be, and in some ways, how little attention policymakers are engaging the work. Certainly for people and individuals, you feel the sense of not belonging, but our policies often and structures often ignore it. And so we think that there's a place there. What I haven't addressed, and I feel like I've already talked too long on this, is the gendered component of this, because there are significant gendered components. And so Black women and Black men encounter similar and different perspectives here in terms of what the challenges are for women to wear their hair in particular ways. There are gendered components to Native boys with long hair, and what it means around these toxic masculinities that get associated with how men should wear their hair. And as someone who at one point had hair down to the middle of my back and now doesn't, and having to make a choice about that and what it means, there's something that becomes really, really important in those conversations. And so our intent is to begin to take up really an intersectional analysis of what we do with hair and terror, and who belongs and who doesn't.
I also have a question in terms of your tribal lit and in regards to critical race theory. You talk about stories are not separate from theory. And I think that's so important as, we go towards the dissertation process, at least for me. And we look at theory and how we're going to infuse theory into the dissertation. But can you talk more about how those stories need to be valued and not looked upon as lesser than in the academy?
Yeah, I started to begin to tap or touch into this where the hair is concerned, but let's think about what theory is. And in some ways, the way theory has been used, which is often inaccessible, it often comes from white men. That's certainly changing, but sort of the classics of theory for me is a form of epistemological violence. So in the tribal crit piece, I start by telling the story about this person who was, I had a close relationship with, who'd had a little bit too much to drink, who said to me, we had just spent this day at the University of Chicago with these anthropologists who were really talking about this theory that was sort of largely inaccessible by many people. I mean, I got it, but it's not something I actually wanted to engage in too heavily. They were actually arguing about the back door of a museum in South Africa, and the way in which the door faced was was symbolic of these things. And I was like, where, I'm sort of thinking to myself, where's the evidence and data of that? Who have you talked to confirm that? Are you just sort of using this as an example to make your case here? And I saw her later that night, and she had a little bit too much to drink and told me that I was never going to be a good theoretician, but I told good stories. And then, I sort of go on to talk about the wisdom of my mom. I think we're beginning to think about theory. It's to say what is theory and what is it? What is its purpose? And theory is like learning. It is ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and it takes on multiple forms, and it just doesn't have to take on these other forms. But the role of theory is to really begin to frame our ideas and begin to provide an architecture for the work that we are trying to do. And so the fact that a story has an architecture and has ideas that are larger framing ideas for us becomes really important. For me, stories in our community do a bunch of things. There are stories about people who drown in the river, and that's a lesson about, one, not to go into that part of the river because of the way in which it flows. It pulls people down to there are these internal mechanisms in it that sort of pull people down, and they don't let them out, and then it pushes them down, and at that point they're drowned. But it also says to us, think about keep your eyes open and pay attention to the world around you and look for things that are beneath the surface in what you're doing. So don't always take things at face value. They are asking us to be a bit and suggesting that we should engage life with a real sense of curiosity, but we should also observe to see what happens in particular places to people as they go in. So if you stand on the banks of the river long enough, you watch and someone drowns. When you're like, I'm not, and then the next person does, and then you're like, that's probably not a good place for us to be swimming. Whenever I go someplace else and I want to get in the water, I always go where native people are, and I get in the water where they're in it, not where other people are in it, because they know. The other piece of that becomes really important is the empirical nature of stories. And I think we sometimes miss the fact that stories are empirical. They often happen over long periods and times of observation, where people then begin to build a theory about why is this happening. And our stories do that for us as well. It's why they frame this. And so for me, I think it's about having an honest conversation about, what do you need theory for? What purposes does it serve for your work and for your dissertation? And if you have stories that are going to do that, then I think it's great. I should also say one other thing. I'm actually not anti those other theories. I'm not. Like, I use Bourdieu and Foucault and Anthony Giddens in my work. They frame how I think about the world. I am in a sense of people like Bourdieu, and a lesser extent of people like Levi-Strauss. I'm a bit of a structuralist. I'm not sort of all in on agency, for example, because I see the way structures work and I see the way they inhibit people. And I'm interested in the ways in which we change their structures so that people can get enabled. But I think that those theories become important. I just don't think that they should be the only theories we have access to. I think we need to be conversant in them so that we, in some ways, are aware of what's out there, even as we are arguing our theories forward. But I think we should take them for what they are worth. And I think theories are only worth things in the sense that they will allow you to advance the work that you're doing and allow you to advance what you're doing. For a while, I was really into critical race theory, and before I sort of, and I'm still sort of thoughtful about it and will engage it. But there were people who would come to me with these questions that really called for structuration theory or called for a neo-Marxist kind of argument and analysis, but they were only going to do critical race theory. And part of what I have said to them is, you can't change a light bulb with a hammer, right? You can't change a socket with a hammer. You can't really bang a nail with a screwdriver. And so what tool do you have accessible to you that will allow you to answer the questions that you've chosen to ask yourself, and the arguments that you want to make. So is CRT like this really lovely theory and idea? Of course it is. Do I think the stories are really important? Of course I do. Do I think that's the only thing that I can use in my work? Well, absolutely not. I think it's really about my exploration. It's about what questions I'm thinking about and taking up, what phenomenon or phenomena I am interested in being more thoughtful about. So I think it really requires folks to move beyond just sort of saying, I'm going to use CRT. Great. What questions are you asking, and how will CRT help you move toward whatever you're trying to answer is? Anyway, I sort of went a long way away from but this is how I roll, Renee. I tend to just sort
No,
of go
that's
with it,
fine. That was
and then
so
my brain goes
informative.
someplace.
Thank you so much. So I have another question. What advice would you provide to future educators so that we can combat this style of territory violence in the school setting?
Yeah, good question. I think for educators, I think there are a couple of things. One is to listen, and we listen in lots of ways, and um, we can sometimes hear things, we see them, we feel them. I tend to think about the work that we do as multisensory and or sensual in nature, that is through the senses. And so I think one is to really pay attention to how students and individuals respond. The power of educators, and as someone who's a former teacher, like I love teachers, love them. And I think that they are vital in necessity to our future and are completely underappreciated. And I understand how hard the work is. So I think some of it is about having the time and the wherewithal to listen to your students first. It is to be thoughtful about what content you are teaching, and mindful about what that content may or may not be doing to students. And in some ways, and this is part of the structural challenge of this, right? It requires educators the time to be able to thoughtfully engage in the material that they are being asked, in some cases forced to teach. So I get the structural challenges with that. I think it's important that teachers are reading a lot and talking a lot. I think that it's important for teachers to think about pedagogical issues. So I've talked about content. I've talked about sort of watching and listening. I think the pedagogical piece of this, which is to be open and mindful about not just about how we teach, but also how we learn, and also our theories about learning for our students. So I think there are curricular and pedagogical issues that come into play here. And then again, I think it's just about being guided and mindful of what's there. I think we all need all of us need to take a look at our policies and ask the same kinds of questions I'm suggesting we ask about our theories, which is, what purpose does this serve? What kinds of things get structured through our theories, whether it's our classroom policies that we set up. So for me as a teacher, I always created our classroom policies with my students, which took, I had a bit more freedom. It was a long time ago, but I really worked with our students to create an environment where they set the rules. They set the terms of the debate. And then we had the freedom in there to come back and say, this isn't working really well for us. How do we begin to change that? So I think and then fundamentally, it's about, how do we think about power? And how do we think about the way in which we theorize power in relation to the content that we teach and the students that we have the privilege of working with? And are we willing to begin to think about sharing and inverting power in particular kinds of ways? So one of the challenges for many educators, including me in my classroom, is I wanted to control my environment, because if I didn't, it would run away from me, right? And I think that's true for lots of us. But how do we begin to think about disrupting that so that the structures of the classroom and the way in which it goes is really shared by community members? So how do we think about relationships a little bit differently and reframe relationships between teachers and students and educators and policies and what have you. So read a lot, talk to people, listen to your students, be mindful of the pedagogical and curricular pieces, which feels a little bit like asking an awful lot of teachers. And educators. So part of what I would say is there's a call, and I get in a lot of trouble for this. I hammer on colleges and schools of education and the faculty in those places to do better by how they prepare future educators for the world. And so I think it's incumbent on us who are preparing educators to do a better job about thinking about the curricular and the pedagogical and the relational as it gets caught up into that before we start sending them out.
Thank you. So I have another question. She's asking, what are you seeing in terms of Indigenous ceremonies in Western institutions? And how can we make sure that more of that is available and done in a life way rather than a performance? So I guess in terms of having like Native ceremonies on campus, and what does that look like, or what should it look like?
Interesting question and a tough question. I think it depends on what people mean by ceremony. So there are some ceremonies that are intended for Indigenous peoples in very particular places, in our longhouses, in our kiva, wherever our ceremonial spots are. They're not exactly religious, not religious in terms of how we think about church, but spiritual, with certainly with some religious elements and undertones to it that I think are really not for public consumption. And so I think that's the case. I think in the sense where there are some ceremonial aspects that we want to think about in terms of making people in institutions aware of how Native people are thinking, I think that needs to be done in relationship and in consultation and really led by tribal communities and tribal leaders, people who actually speak on behalf of tribal nations. But I want to zero in on what I think is really one of the important pieces of this question, which is so that it's not ceremonial in nature. That is so crucial, because I've come to find, and this isn't exactly about ceremonies, but I think that land acknowledgements, for example, have become performative in very particular ways. And I think, look, the land acknowledgements are what they are, which is for us to just have a fundamental and basic decency to say, I'm on someone else's land. I recognize that ancestrally they were the guardians of this land and that they still walk among us. The issue then beyond that is, what are our institutions doing? Because acknowledgements are one thing. What are the concomitant responsibilities that follow those acknowledgements? What are we doing to support Native peoples as students, as faculty on our campus? What are we doing to better our relations with the people who are the original inhabitants of the land? So Pitt sits on the lands of Seneca and Shawnee and Lenape peoples and others, right? What is Pitt doing, for example? And I'm not dogging on your institution, just to be clear. It's not my job. I'm not interested in that. But it's an example that works for me. So what's Pitt doing to make good relations with those people? So Shawnee get moved to Oklahoma, right? Very intentionally as part of making way for people. So if you're going to have a land acknowledgement in an institution, what are you doing to begin to make relations right and to be in good relation with people, so that it's not just performative, but there's actually some meaning behind it? I think if we're going to do ceremonies that tribes are willing to do on campus, they should be relational in nature and not transactional in nature. So sometimes it's sort of well, you just do this and it allows us to absolve ourselves of all of these things. So if you're going to do those ceremonies, it should, for me, connote that there is a long-term relationship and commitment to that relationship between tribal communities and its peoples and the institution itself. And that moves beyond the performative aspects of it to say, this is going to become part of it. So the work I'm trying to do at my own institution, which isn't perfect, just to be clear, I'm not suggesting it um, is to begin to make certain pieces of ceremony and recognition of Indigenous peoples part of the DNA of our institution, so that it becomes part of what we do, regardless of who the president or the provost or the dean are. It's just the way we do things. So how do we begin to create new structures where ceremonies and recognitions of relationships and original inhabitants of land, in this instance, become part of what we do? And so we just say, that's part of what we do. Of course, we have to do some land acknowledgement, and of course, we have to then have the responsibilities that follow from that. And of course, we've got to build these programs because that's who we are as an institution, as part of our fabric. And always, 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 I tie it back to our charter, our purpose, or whatever. I think if we look at the purposes and what we say our institutions are about, there's room and opening for all of it. Because all of our institutions say that they want to support diversity of thought and peoples. They say that they want to serve a public. They say that they want to be externally facing. We build the DNA and the fabric of the institution by going to those founding documents and then saying, here's how it fits. So there's got to be some strategic components of that in terms of the work that it's doing. If you look at what your unit has done under your relatively new dean, she's been there, I guess, three or 4 years now. It's pretty remarkable, the transformation and the structures that are being built under leadership. That becomes super important in terms of the work. If you got a strong leader who says, this is what we're about, and this is what we believe, this is how we're going to be in the world, that's how that happens. So anyway, again, I'm far away from the ceremonial piece, but it can't be performative. It's got to be, and it can't be transactional. It's got to be relational.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brayboy. We are so honored to have you here. I'm going to transition to Dr. T. Elon Dancy, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Urban Education and the Associate Dean of Equity and Justice here at the School of Education. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. An important call for institutions right at the end here to transition us to our close. I want to take a moment to thank our visiting scholar, Dr. Brian Brayboy, for his thoughtful mind and compelling talk, as well as our interlocutor, our department chair of teaching, learning, and leading, Dr. Sabina Vaught. The center is grateful for Brian and Sabina's generative conversation. And among offerings, I'm particularly appreciating the attention to the ways the talk and follow-up conversation ask us to confront the ways state violence against Native peoples has not ended. It's not a past event, but it is ongoing, recomposes, and reenacts, in the role of Genesis amnesia in that. This also reminded me about Donato Macedo's idea of stupidification and the pedagogy of big lies as a framework for this violence and as dangerous educational practice. So my thanks to Brian and Sabina for where their engagement carried my thinking. And thanks to our graduate student chair moderator, Robin Renee Albritton. If you're joining us for the first time, the Center for Urban Education's mantra is learn, share, and transform. Learning speaks to the knowledge we produce. Share speaks to our efforts to share what we know and provide forum for our colleagues to do the same, such as this event, but also the vision of mutual aid that is important for us, to us. And transform speaks to our purpose. We're interested in transforming education structures around power and power relations. The Lunch and Learn Public Talk is an initiative that engages this mantra. Our thanks to our center team, particularly Cassia Krogan and Sueño Viveros, for their care of this event, and our supportive dean, Dr. Valerie Kinlock. Join us Thursday, November 5th, when we will welcome Kali Akuno, the co-founder and co-director of Cooperation Jackson and co-editor of Jackson Rising, The Struggle for Economic Democracy and Black Self-Determination in Jackson, Mississippi. He will be joined by our own Sabina Vaught and Q graduate student Chris Wright. We envision this as a relevant and timely dialogue that will not only engage the current US presidential election that's upcoming, but help us to think about activism and political education more broadly. You don't want to miss that. Finally, know that we regularly update our website. Go to qcue.pitt.edu to sign up for our listserv so you can receive news about our events and our other projects. While you're on our website, check out our recent newsletter where you can read about our research, teaching, and service. Thanks so much for attending today. Take good care and be safe.